Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australia has been home to some huge fintech success stories. Think companies like Afterpay, Airwallex, but more local successes are focusing overseas, pushed out by limited access to capital here and too many regulatory hurdles. That's according to the EY FinTech Australia Census 2023, which also reveals just how many fintechs are actually profitable. Malia Forner is the Oceania FinTech Leader at EY. Malia, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hi, Sean. Pleasure to be here.
This is the 8th year of your fintech census. Let's start with money. We like that. How profitable are Australian fintechs?
Oh, well, the 8th FinTech Census has certainly shown us that the fintech sector in Australia just is continuing to demonstrate both growing maturity, but really importantly, some record-breaking success. So in terms of profitability and also income, we're seeing this year that a massive 88% of fintech census respondents are actually reporting that they're generating income from sales. And that's the highest proportion we've ever seen since we started the census now 8 years ago. But Sean, what's even more remarkable is that 43% of fintechs in Australia are now in fact making a profit. And that's compared to 30% last year. So even in just that 12-month period, we've seen a 13% increase. And Sean, what I find that quite remarkable is that's also against a more competitive and challenging consumer environment.
Okay, so why do you think they're doing so well? Well, relatively well.
They're doing relatively well because we're seeing sector maturity. When we started the census 8 years ago, Sean, we were still having to define for people outside of the financial services sector what fintech actually meant and what the verticals of fintech meant. And now we've got so many different verticals of fintech, both in Australia but also globally. And so what we've seen is that sector maturity, which has been backed by government investment over that period, is showing that they can and they are not only competing with banks and financial institutions for customers, but they're also solving needs for customers and therefore turning an income, making sales, and also really importantly, making profit.
Okay, so not everyone is going to know exactly what an Aussie fintech looks like. And in fact, when I think about it, I sort of think of payments businesses, and I mentioned Afterpay and I mentioned Airwallex, but it's much broader than that, isn't it?
It is much broader than that. There's many different verticals of fintechs in Australia now. Payments is still the number one sector of fintechs in Australia. That's followed by data and analytics, payments verticals, and also business tools or wealth verticals. What we've also seen in an emerging sector, both in Australia and globally, is this concept of embedded finance. Now, I'm quite excited about the concept of embedded finance because it's a trend that we see merging both financial services but non-financial services sectors. So think about that with your everyday purchases that you're making from your phone, your Apple Watch, any other digital commercial infrastructure that you can now purchase for any services, be it insurance, be it an actual physical product. It's embedded finance that's driving that.
Stay with me, Malia. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Malia Forner, Oceania FinTech Leader at EY. One thing I did notice in the survey is that there are very few young companies, so we are maturing. I get that. I think 3% or something or other, or 1 year or younger. A lot more last year. I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing, though, because I think wouldn't we like a stream of startups?
Oh, we would always like a stream of startups. Not only do we like it, I think the economy needs it for the future productivity and innovation of the sector. So it's a really interesting data point the census has shown us this year that you're right, Sean, it's shown us there's just 3% of fintechs that are now 1 year or younger. And that's compared to 10% just in 2022. Now, Sean, one of my hypotheses on this is that it could suggest that the startups are facing significantly higher barriers to entry than they were 12 months ago into Australia, when we did see a greater influx of new entrants that came out of the COVID lockdowns, with everything being digital becoming in vogue. Or alternatively, an alternative hypothesis is that we're seeing an equilibrium here, because we are off on a backdrop of there being around 900 fintechs in Australia alone, which is a relatively sizable number given the size of our economy. And so we could be coming into this period of equilibrium and or normalization as well. But certainly what we're seeing is there are barriers. So it is harder to make it as a startup and to grow your company because of reduced local limited capital, complex regulatory hurdles, and thirdly, overseas direct investment strategies from overseas governments and financial hubs are certainly tempting our local success stories to, as you said in the opener, focus efforts offshore.
Okay, so let's break those down. Access to finance, it's harder now. Is that because investors are more circumspect? Is it an interest rate issue? What do you think?
It could certainly be a couple of those reasons for sure, but it's also, there's an increased uncertain macro environment that we're operating within, and capital raising is becoming more difficult across the sector, across all of the verticals. And in fact, the overall proportion of fintechs said that they had not met their capital raising expectations in the past 12 months, surged to 41% this year. And that was up from 29% just in 2022. And interestingly, the fintechs this year in Australia are actually ranking raising that equity capital as their top concern for the year ahead, with 61% citing it as their biggest challenge. And that's even well ahead of the uncertain economic climate, which ranked at second.
Okay, what about regulatory hurdles? That was another one you mentioned. Is the Australian legislative environment kind of, it must be very difficult to keep up with the fintech sector, to be honest. Years ago, I used to work at Supervision Department in Reserve Bank, which is now known as APRA, right? And trying to keep up with what the banks were doing was really hard. Fintech's the next level. Do we have a regulatory environment that suits fintech?
The regulatory environment's come a really long way just in the last 5 years, but it's hard to keep up with it from a government and regulatory perspective, because the rules change both when you're operating with financial services, but you're also operating with financial means and user data of people means it is complex and it changes quickly. But what is really important is that what we've seen is fintech is critical in supporting the growth of our entire Australian digital economy. And so we need to keep focused on the fact that we need to continue globally competitive incentive models, but also streamlining regulation and, importantly, continuing some trade and investment programs. Clearly, the government has been really successful in helping fintechs and startups alike be a multiplier here in Australia, and the census points the way to that.
Okay, so having said all that, we still do have a bunch of fintechs looking overseas. Also, we have offshore fintechs looking at the Australian market as well. But let's think about us looking off. Is there more of that, more Australian fintechs looking to make their money elsewhere?
Well, they are, in fact, making that money elsewhere. What's really interesting with the data this year is we're seeing that Australian fintechs are producing 50% of the income that we spoke about right at the beginning offshore. Now, I think that's an incredible statistic, because it means that they're clearly focusing their efforts for customers, for investors, for users offshore. And it must be working, because 50% of the revenue for the fintechs, from a statistical point of view, are being sought overseas.
I mean, that's the wonderful thing about being a fintech, isn't it? You don't have to have bricks and mortar in some ways, I suppose.
Exactly. No geographic barriers.
Okay, so where to next? What's the next 5 years hold for the sector? Any more Afterpays out there, do you reckon?
Well, I certainly hope so, and I certainly think so. I certainly don't have a crystal ball, not one that works, Sean. But I certainly think that the Australian fintech sector has an incredibly strong record of innovation and growth. But to continue that positive trajectory, it's quite clear that some immediate changes are needed to continue to make Australia an incredibly attractive environment to both start and grow a business.
Go on. What do we need?
Well, I think what we need there, Sean, is we need to keep using incentives. We need to keep using grants to expand and attract both that domestic and foreign investments that you spoke about, because it's not just about our domestic companies going global. We want them to start thinking global and go global, but it's also about attracting these incredible offshore organizations to want to set up headquarters in Australia as well. And often that is through globally competitive incentives and, really importantly, reducing the barriers to entry to do so. And that's going to be in part for this sector to maintain some secure and stable regulations so that we can really build on our strong foundations as the regional financial hub for Asia Pacific.
Malia, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Sean.
That was Malia Forner, EY Oceania. There you go. I said it wrong. That was Malia Forner, EY Oceania FinTech Leader. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's best business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.